All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the last of the ITS Davis Friday afternoon seminars of fall quarter 2023. I think we've got a really fun one for you today. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Jake Berman, who is an attorney in New York, who does government contract
yes.
law. Okay, so there is a connection to transportation, but he is not our typical speaker in that transportation is not his main reason for being, although actually I think it is kind of a big reason for being these days. Right, so transportation as a sideline, and he's just got some really great stories and some really great insights about build transit in the US, which a lot of us care about. So please join me in welcoming Jake.
Thanks.
And a book, he's got a book.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So I want to thank Susan and UCD for having me here. As you've heard, I'm Jake Berman, and this talk is going to be a little bit unorthodox because it's going to discuss, well, why is transit not so great and why is housing so expensive? And unlike a lot of the seminars that are going to happen here, I'm going to be treating housing and transit as more or less two sides of the same coin, because like I've said, my background is as an attorney. And so thinking about the kinds of bureaucratic processes that you need to get transit to work and housing to work are actually quite similar. I just want to survey the room really quickly. What sort of backgrounds do we have? Planners? Engineers? Okay, economists? Let's see. Envirosci? Okay. Anybody else that I've missed?
All of the above, kind of.
All of the above, gotcha.
Sociology, psychology,
History.
physics.
History, okay, great. Great, so just to start with where this all came from, please do not ask me for career advice. I will give you bad advice. Because my background is that I went to high school in Davis. I went to undergrad at Berkeley and studied history there. After that, I went to law school at NYU. And while I was in law school, I took a job in Los Angeles and was commuting on the 101 freeway and was stuck in traffic for the better part of an hour behind a fellow in a Jeep going nowhere with too many bumper stickers. And I said to myself, my commute is 5 miles, why can't I take the train? And so all of the maps that are flashing behind me are from the Lost Subways of North America project, which is now my book. The way that all this got started was fine, I get stuck in traffic, I'm irritated, frustration is a great driver of creativity, so I go to the library and think, what is wrong with Los Angeles' transit? This is a major city, why can't I take the train to and from downtown LA? And this was my commute. In this, I found an ancient map of the Los Angeles red car system, which had, in all caps, the largest electric railway system in the world plastered on top of it. And I thought to myself, in Los Angeles? The largest electric railway system in the world? Okay, well, this is a story that perhaps needs to be told. And so after modernizing some of the maps and showing them to friends and family, I started digging into the transit histories of other cities. And you find out that a lot of the stories that relate to the decline of transit in North America kind of rhyme with one another. You know, you have a streetcar era, which ended up turning into a freeway era where the privately owned streetcar monopolies went away. And then after that, the transit never really came back. And most of the transit that works well in the United States nowadays is the product of legacy investments that were made decades ago. So with that, I'm gonna go to how did we do things in the old days before. I'm gonna set 1945 as my cutoff date because that's right before the freeway era truly starts. So before 1945, with land use, you have a relatively organic development model. So the idea before 1945 was that if you build a high capacity transit system, like say an elevated or a subway line, it makes perfect sense to build it through empty farmland and a city will pop up around it. So there are some wonderful pictures of the New York City subway around 1918 where the number 7 train going out to Flushing, Queens, and if you're a Mets fan, you take that train. But it's through empty farmland. It's an elevated viaduct through empty farmland built with the expectation that private developers would decide to locate new apartment buildings, new housing, new office buildings near all of this new transit. Sort of, if you build it, they will come. And more or less, that's how things worked. The amount of development on a piece of land largely matched its land value. So, you know, if you're ever in New York City and you come out to my neck of the woods, you can get on the A train at the World Trade Center, which has towers of 60 and up stories surrounding it. And you take the train outbound 4 miles, get off at Nostrand Avenue, and it's a quiet residential neighborhood, but it's all 6 and 4 story apartment buildings. Go outbound 4 miles more and you're at Euclid Avenue, where it's still row houses and there's no gaps between buildings, but these buildings are 2 to 3 stories tall and they'll have a triplex or a duplex instead of a full-blown apartment building. Keep going outbound another 4 miles to the end of the line at Lefferts Boulevard, and you're still within New York City, but the houses are recognizably suburban. There are front and backyards. There's off-street parking. They're all separated houses that were built before 1945, but it's still a recognizably suburban development model. Now, as for transport, there was a lot of synergy between transport and land use. So if, all right, who here has gone over the Bay Bridge once in a row? Everybody? Cool. So the lower deck of the Bay Bridge used to carry commuter trains, well, electric interurban commuter trains over the Bay Bridge to and from the old Transbay Terminal in downtown San Francisco. Those trains were known as the Key System, but their owner was something called the Realty Syndicate. They were a real estate developer that happened to own a railway. And if you've ever been past the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley, which is a beautiful building, that was built by the Realty Syndicate to promote transit use and vice versa. You have these synergies across a lot of different businesses though. So if you're dealing with, like it doesn't have to be real estate development. In Los Angeles and in Oakland, it was tied to real estate development, but in Seattle, it was tied to the electric company. The same thing in Atlanta, where Georgia Power, which still runs the electric grid, was the transit provider until the 1940s. There wasn't a whole lot of planning per se, the way that we treat it today. Like planning studies are much more straightforward and assume a lot of things that today we would have to prove with complicated models. And I think and the way that things were designed back then also reflects a certain sort of economy of scale. So like if you get on the number 6 subway built in 1904 in New York City, you'll find that all of the local stations along the line are copy pastes of one another. The same thing goes in Philadelphia. If you get on the Market Street subway there, all of the stations are copy pastes of one another. So you do get those economies of scale and you can really plan big projects. The other thing is that back then there was not a whole lot of public process related to transport planning. Like you might have an election, you would have the city council or the board of supervisors vote on a particular thing. To build the first Muni line in San Francisco in 1912, it took a bond issue, which was a public vote, and then a vote of the Board of Supervisors to start construction and pick contractors. This is how, from the initial Muni vote in 1910 to the opening of Muni's first line in 1912, they managed to build an entire line from Geary and Market to Golden Gate Park, which is a good 5 miles away. The actual construction took 6 months start to finish. Like, this kind of speed is not something that we can do today, but it's not because we don't have the technological or the engineering skill. Like, there are a lot of very good engineers in this room, I'm sure, but the question is getting the bureaucracy right. And like, the results of this type of planning model are that you get the kinds of neighborhoods that everyone loves and are extremely difficult to find someplace affordable to live today. So if you think about it, this is how you get, in an urban model, you get like North Beach in San Francisco, you get Greenwich Village or the Upper West Side in Manhattan, you get Silver Lake in Los Angeles, all of which were built around this kind of liberal model of transit-oriented development. The thing is, this also had its downsides, which is why this era ended, right? So first of all, you have the issues of monopoly power, where like, it's not a good idea to have PG&E control both your mass transit and to have a monopoly of how you get around and to also control your electric grid. And that's how it used to be in Sacramento. Sacramento used to have PG&E both providing its streetcar service and its electricity. So the second issue with this is that transit was used as a loss leader. So the real estate development business was where they made their real money, and transit was a bit of an afterthought. In Los Angeles, most notably, the Pacific Electric Railway started falling apart on its passenger service in the 1920s, fully 3 decades before the system collapsed. And so, because of this, they made a whole lot of reforms at the end of the streetcar era to change this. So the Wheeler-Rayburn Act broke up these transit electricity linkages. So you couldn't use, so transit and electricity were no longer connected. They broke up the linkages between transportation on the one hand and real estate development, which in some countries that still do this, like Hong Kong does it with the MTR and Japan Rail in Japan, where real estate developers are the railway companies and vice versa, and they cross-subsidize each other. But because of all these issues relating to monopoly power and the ways that, and the kinds of abuses that made these transport monopolies so hated, this is how you end up with situations like Detroit, where Detroit had the choice in the early 1920s to either enter into a public-private partnership to build a citywide subway system on the scale of the Chicago Elevated, or to bring the privately owned streetcar system under public control. There were only 2 options because the city of Detroit didn't have the money to do both. So the city of Detroit and its mayor, Jim Cousins, decided, well, no, our problem are these evil monopolists in the Detroit United Railway who have been nickel and diming us, literally because the fare was a nickel, for decades now. We need to see them gone. We need to get rid of this ugly monopoly, and we will figure it out later and build our subway when we get the chance. Then the Great Depression happened and they never got the chance. So after this era ends, and a nice cutoff is the end of World War II, 1945, you see a pretty dramatic shift towards what we have today. So on the land use end, you still have a relatively liberal land use regime where the amount of development still matches the value of the land, right? So Los Angeles does a decent job of this, weirdly enough, because like driving out the Wilshire corridor from downtown LA towards Santa Monica, you really do see a lot of the ways that you end up with these towers in like Century City and things like that were a product of the kind of anything goes attitude towards urban growth. Development is easy, especially in the suburbs. And like densification still happens both at the high scale, at both the very high end scale and the very low end scale. So if you have So for instance, in like, you'll see these like 1960s high rises in San Francisco or in Los Angeles or in New York City that are predominantly residential. And those are the products of the combination of modern technology and liberal land use laws. But also there's something called the dingbat, where yes, it's actually called that. The dingbat is a sort of 2-story apartment building or maybe 3-story apartment building with a few parking spaces and a carport. And a lot of you have probably lived in one of these things and you didn't know it. There's a wonderful report out of Berkeley from 1964 called the Speculative Low-Rise Apartment. And it discusses how much of the real estate development that happened in the Bay Area in the 50s and 60s was people who weren't even real estate dudes or dudettes, going and deciding to build these small-scale wood apartment buildings for regular people, which is not something that particularly happens nowadays with new construction. And having these types, so like there's still development happening across the board. As far as transport, it's still easy to build things. And this is how you get the stupid ideas of building freeways through urban cores. I'm not gonna lie, race was a huge factor in this. Like the quote unquote blighted areas that made up so much of the areas that were cut up by freeways, like it wasn't an accident that there were poor people, minorities, or minorities who happen to be poor people that got the short end of the stick. But like, you know, it's part of the whole utopian spirit of the age that was really a thing in the 1960s, between like, you know, World War II and about 1975. The thing is, this is an overreach. It's a stupid idea to demolish most of your city so that you can drive more. And like the results you can see in most cities in North America, like, I mean, Sacramento's just across the causeway and you can see what the WX freeway or Route 50 has done to the areas around it. I mean, like it's still a scar on downtown and midtown, and the blocks north and south are far poorer and a little bit sketchier compared to once you start getting further north in midtown Sacramento. And so because of this, there are a whole suite of reforms that end up happening. On the one end are the great environmental reforms of the 1960s and 70s. So CEQA in California, NEPA, plus the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, thanks to Dick Nixon. And like these sorts of reforms really empower the sort of neighborhood opposition that stopped the freeways in the first place. So in San Francisco, for instance, the city didn't get cut up by a bunch of freeways precisely because of these types of freeway revolts. They were the first one to really have this fight, but the fight repeated itself in New Orleans, Washington, DC, and especially in the Canadian cities, which got a later start on their freeways and ultimately decided to scrap most of them. Which brings us to the era since 1978 or so. 1978 is what I use as my cutoff here because that's when Prop 13 happens. Are there people here who don't know what that is? Okay, great. This is cool. So in California, Proposition 13 stipulates that if you own a piece of land and you can be a person, you can be a landlord owning a second home, you can be a company owning a building, you can be a factory if you want. The property tax rate is frozen, the property tax valuation is frozen at the level that it was at purchase with small increases for inflation. So it means that if you bought a house in 1990 for say $200,000, the annual inflation increases mean that you're probably paying tax based on $300,000, but it's certainly not market rate, which means that there's all kinds of incentives for homeowners in particular to stay in their neighborhoods and to try to freeze them as much as possible. Conveniently, this also does a couple of things where not only is this a convenient way to freeze neighborhoods in place and increase property values, but because it happened at the same time that segregation and like all the types of racial covenants were really coming down, it was also considered a socially acceptable way to price out minorities. Like, you know, it's like Beverly Hills is a great example of this, where Beverly Hills had racial covenants for a very long time, saying that, you know, one shall not sell this piece of property to Hebrews, Malays, Chinese, Filipinos, you name it, that kind of thing. It was just banned. Too bad, so sad. And after like all of those things after all the segregation restrictions were voided, there was a large movement towards banning new housing construction altogether. So they've actually been quite good at this in stopping new housing construction. Beverly Hills now has the same population today that it did in 1970. I wasn't even alive then, probably a lot of you weren't either. And so the thing is, like, you know, if you can't build in the city neighborhoods where things are plentiful, where things are relatively inexpensive, if you can't build in desirable city neighborhoods and there's not a whole lot of regulation of building things outside of the city, well then, okay, great. Where are you gonna build? Out in the boonies, the Mojave Desert, fire zones, tomato farms like outside Davis. And like, this means that your predominant development model is going to be suburban sprawl. Like, I can't think of any neighborhood that's really well built that was built during this period at all. I mean, there are some attempts at recreating the ways of the past, like, you know, Celebration, Florida, right? Which is, you know, a Disney property. There are attempts to recreate this type of old-fashioned development pattern, but they always make so many concessions to the automobile that it's really, really difficult to get people to actually get out of their cars and walk places. In this type of land use model, you have a lot of mandates for suburban style development. So like Culver City near LA requires all new buildings that are commercial space to be 50% parking by square footage. This is normal. It ain't like 50% parking by square footage. Now, the law codes don't say that, but you accomplish it in different ways by, like if your zoning code says that you have to have one parking space for every 400 square feet of office space, well, one parking space takes up 400 square feet if you include the space that you need for the car to get in and out of the garage. These types of restrictions became universal, and most of the time, old-fashioned buildings are generally larger in terms of square footage than what you find getting built today. Like in the old days, before World War II, it was very common, even in quote-unquote suburban areas, to put like a 10,000 square foot building onto a 5,000 square foot lot. Nowadays, it's much more common to have a limitation that says, okay, great, you have a 5,000 square foot lot, you get 2,500 square feet. Like, there's also the usage restrictions, which mean that, you know, it's harder to have a corner store. It's like neighborhoods are very rigidly zoned for the most part nowadays. And these types of, sidebar, do I have to describe zoning? Are there people who don't understand what I'm talking about? Cool, just making sure. But because of the rigid delineations between zoning of commercial, residential, and industrial spaces, you also end up reinforcing that loop where the automobile is really the only practical way to get around. Davis still has this sort of rigid zoning regime but that said, because they've installed so much bicycle infrastructure here, you can actually get away with having a very high bicycle mode share because there are bike lanes everywhere. And so that, you know, that 15-minute walk or that 20-minute walk turns into a 5-minute bike ride, and you can still bike over to the grocery store and be back within 10 minutes. This also is the era since 1978 is also the era when public transport becomes being treated as an amenity for a region, as opposed to an essential part of the as opposed to an essential part of a transport network. So if you have like SAC RT light rail, VTA in San Jose, DART in Dallas, the San Diego trolley to a lesser extent, all of these were built to keep up with the Joneses. You know, there was a certain stream of thought in this era that, well, great, there's light rail in Portland, so we need one too. There's a light rail system in Edmonton in Canada, well, we need one too. And oftentimes, this era of transport planning has really, really crummy transport because the large-scale transit investments that you make are not going to be necessarily tied to what you build, or like it's not tied to how people need to get from point A to point B. Like VTA light rail in San Jose is a great example of it. Their ridership figures are some of the lowest in the country. It doesn't go anywhere. Like it serves a bunch of suburban office parks. It serves a bunch of suburbs, and the areas around the train stations are pretty dead because all there is around is parking. So like this is something you can also see in Sacramento with RT light rail. Like I've taken RT light rail exactly once, and I wrote the book on this. But it's that idea of, okay, well, public transport is an amenity. It's also how you get to having so many light rail systems in particular that are not particularly well designed. So if I told you, like, Dallas has a rail system the size of the Barcelona Metro.
Technically, I think it does.
Yeah, technically it is. It's absolutely true in terms of track miles. Yeah, it's the same as the Barcelona Metro. How useful is it? Not very. And so and coupled with this is and the way that all of these things tie together is that because of the public process reforms you make to have environmental review, local vetoes, stricter land use controls, you do end up with the situation that we have today, where housing is expensive, transit is underused, even systems which were originally designed pretty well are now facing fiscal cliffs, like AC Transit in Oakland, which is the descendant of the old Key system. Even BART, which for many years was a success story in American transit, is now facing a fiscal cliff because it doesn't have those supportive land uses near the train stations. BART was designed to be a commuter system to get to downtown SF, and now with the rise of remote work, well, that ain't going away anytime soon. You also run into the now very common situation where if you have a major piece of infrastructure, it's just expected that you're going to have lots of bad public process involved. So to cycle back to where we started with Muni building a streetcar line on Geary, they did that start to finish in 6 months. And now to build the same line in the late 20th and early 21st century, they're on 34 years and counting. San Franciscans have been paying taxes for this for 34 years and counting, and they've gotten bupkis. And the reason, and coupled with all of this and making this even more of a problem, is that transit authorities, along with a lot of other bureaucratic competencies, have generally been hollowed out. I mean, a lot of you, I'm sure, are checking out jobs with the transit authority in X city, and these types of roles do not pay nearly as well as the private sector. The benefits might be great, but it would be nice to have another 30, 40 grand a year. And these types of low pay, not particularly great working conditions, you're trying to oversee things that are not necessarily within your area of competency, mean that transit construction projects tend to run late, they tend to be way over budget, and they're very hard to keep on track, if you'll pardon the pun, because so much of it has to be done in a particular, it has to be done by micromanaging the individual contractors, but micromanaging your contractors when you don't have this internal competency to begin with is a problem. So that's the situation. Everyone here has tried to rent an apartment in Northern California, so you know what the results are. I mean, everyone here has tried to take Amtrak up to Sacramento or down to the Bay Area. We all know what this looks like today. So the next part of this is say, well, okay, great. What do we do about this? How do we do things either in the old way? How do other places do this? Because America is pretty bad at this. The first thing, like just right off the bat, this is a thing where we can learn by imitation. I know this is the Institute for Transportation Studies. I know American innovation is something that the US is really good at, but this is not a situation where we should be attempting to innovate. We should be ripping other people's ideas off and doing it shamelessly. So like for instance, if with land use, like European cities never let go of the old way of doing things. So if you look at the housing market in, say, Madrid and compare it to Los Angeles, about 2/3 of the new homes being built in Madrid today are being built as either townhouses, where the houses are bang up right next to each other like the Victorians in San Francisco, or they're apartment buildings. And only 10% of new homes being built in the province of Madrid, last I checked, are the types of separated single-family houses that you see here in California. The other thing that they do is that the development process is generally pretty streamlined. There's the regulations that mandate auto-centric development just don't exist there, and so you can have suburbs that have good transit because of this. So like Spanish apartment buildings still have garages. Spanish townhouses still have garages. The difference is you have one parking space and a street of row houses as opposed to a 3-car garage and separated detached single family, which makes it impossible to serve well by transit. Like this is the norm in Europe, more or less. In terms of transit, like it really comes down to having and establishing these bureaucratic competencies. Bureaucracy has to be properly staffed and you have to pay people competitively. Like a lot of the public process issues that we face where, 3 angry people who lost the election keep showing up and badgering the city council, like a lot of these public processes and public consultations need to be reformed. Because quite frankly, if you had an election where the entire county or the entire metropolis voted to do a particular thing, then that's all the authorization that you need. In particular, and this is something that I find very interesting about European models of doing this, is that first, things like environmental clearance don't have a private right of action. So the state bureaucracy is monitoring it for compliance with environmental law, but you do not get spurious environmental cases coming about like their equivalent of CEQA because the review is being done by the government itself. There's no private right of action. The other thing is that these major transit construction tends to be self-permitting in Europe. So once there's been an authorization from the city council or the province or whatever it may be, there's no need to get clearance from the local municipalities who may or may not have a built-in agenda to stop you. So Beverly Hills, which I keep returning to because I don't particularly like Beverly Hills, is Beverly Hills is a great example of this in action in California, where the city of, the voters of LA County voted to build the Wilshire Boulevard subway in LA in 1980. And the city of Beverly Hills and the school board of Beverly Hills raised absolute hell both at the local, state, and federal levels. To the point that they convinced their congressman, Henry Waxman, to ban tunneling to Beverly Hills and West LA. The grounds were pretty nonsensical, but it doesn't matter because they got their congressman to ban it. This is why the Wilshire Boulevard subway in LA won't be done until 2028. Now, if this situation were self-permitting, they wouldn't have any choice in the matter. The other thing that's missing right now is copy-paste. A lot of the things that go on, a lot of the issues that go on with American transit construction and its high cost of construction is that there's not a whole lot of standardization, and there's not a whole lot of infrastructure that gets done in the old-fashioned way of copy-pasting the stations one by one, standardized methods of construction, standardized staffing practices, standard equipment. Italians are incredibly good at building subway systems because they just copy-paste the Milan Metro over and over and over again. If you want to know what the Milan Metro looks like, it's a bit like the plane train in the Atlanta airport. It's just like they keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, so you get the kinds of economies of scale that we do not do here. And instead, you end up with a situation where everything is custom designed in the United States, or most things are custom designed, so it's very hard to make things work correctly. A great example of this is the 2nd Avenue subway in New York City, where because everything was custom designed, everything was very heavily, it was very poorly managed by the New York City by the New York City MTA. It became quite difficult for people to actually finish building the thing, and it took 20 years to go 3 stops. The other thing is that the scale of construction got significantly bigger than it really needed to be, because the MTA in New York doesn't have the bureaucratic competencies to keep their contractors in check. And I realize that I'm part of a contractor industrial complex because I work for a government contractor, but I don't represent the, oh yeah, I should probably have a disclaimer. What I say doesn't reflect my employer's opinions about this. But like, all of this is relatively fixable. And the thing is, and the most interesting thing I've found in studying this is that there are places which don't have these competencies initially. Istanbul has done a really fascinating job of making the transition from bringing in outside expertise to learn, to dig their tunnels and build their metro system, to developing internal Turkish expertise, and then ultimately to bringing everything in-house and having an industry that's built around good, efficient, and repeatable ways of building a subway system. The Istanbul Metro doesn't cover everything in the metropolis, but it's expanding at such a rapid rate that it will pretty soon. And this is because they developed these internal competencies and imported them from abroad. So just to close it out, things don't have to be like this, right? It's quite possible for the United States to get out of our rut of lousy transit and overpriced housing. But the thing is, it requires bureaucratic changes. It requires changes in how we think. And as much as I hate to say the P word, it'll also require politics, because these things weren't handed down on Mount Sinai. You know, there is no, nobody is giving Moses stone tablets saying, thou shalt have 3 parking spaces per single family home. But that requires actual change and reanalyzing what it is that we're doing and the ways that we're thinking. So, questions? Yes.
A question for you. So near the very end of your presentation, you spoke about how oftentimes within our transit bureaucracies in the United States, we don't have the background knowledge has been hollowed out, or the institutional knowledge has been hollowed out in the methods to now manage our different contractors that are now performing duties for our transit agencies and transit planning agencies. My question is, so like when we look at the Chinese outward bound, this is just from my own background, but we see oftentimes China is building infrastructure projects for developing countries. And the argument has often been that, okay, some of these big infrastructure projects are just not built in a high quality manner. And why is that? Because you actually need individuals, similar to the way that if you're having a contractor come into your house to redo your bathroom, you need the institutional knowledge of what do you actually have to put in to build a good bathroom? What do you have to put in to build a good subway or train line? In the United States, is that a potential problem? The fact that, as you said, there's the institutional knowledge has been hollowed out. And now we have individuals who they're supposed to manage different third parties, but this is not their area of expertise. And so to a certain extent, they're getting a lower quality project and lower quality implementation than if it was in-house.
Sure, so I think that this competency is lacking in the United States. Also, did people hear the question? Can you hear me on the internet? People, can you hear me? Okay, cool. All right, cool. So I think that having these institutional competencies hollowed out is a problem, but there's no time better than the present to start learning how to do things correctly. Importing specifically international expertise is something that I heavily favor because there is not a whole lot of, there are a whole lot of people working in the construction management industry and in this sector, but in the United States, but we don't know what we don't know. There is no particular, these types of standardizations are second nature if you're European. I'm not familiar particularly with the Asian way of doing things, so you'll have to forgive me. But the European way of doing things is something that can be taught and can be learned and passed down. It's not something that's an all or nothing. If it means using European experts to first train Americans and then to pass that knowledge on and bring people in as necessary, that can be done. It's just a question of doing. Yes.
You kind of held up the Istanbul example as a model for getting people on board with this idea of building a modern transportation system and then creating the internal expertise to do it and then having it be a point of pride. I guess the question is how, not so much that how they did it, but how did they engender the political will or the desire to create that system in the first place? And is that replicable here in the United States?
Sure. So the question is, quite frankly, I think that if you have something like Istanbul, it's a special case because it's a rapidly developing country. It's a middle income country. And if you think LA traffic is bad, try getting on the freeway in Istanbul because the public infrastructure just is not up to snuff. I think that I'm not a politician, obviously, and if you ever see me running for office, I have been taken over by aliens from space. But building the political will is really just a question of politics, and quite frankly, a lot of the political will is already there. Los Angeles has passed 4 major votes in the last 25 years to not only pay for transit, but to raise their taxes repeatedly to build out a modern rapid transit network in greater LA. Transit bills routinely pass in places that have bad traffic congestion. Here, the problem is our institutions are not capable of building out the infrastructure that the public demands because of all these public process issues that I talked about ad nauseum. Yes.
So you talked a lot about international examples. Do you personally have an example of a transit project in North America that you think comes the closest to this sort of idealized scenario of cost controls and in-house engineering work, and why that project turned out that way?
Sure. So the Montreal Metro, the initial build out of the Montreal Metro is a perfect example of how you can get something done quickly, cheaply, and competently. The Montreal Metro was originally approved in 1960, and the initial operating segments of the system were opened in 1966 in time for the '67 World's Fair. So we're talking 6-7 years start to finish. And I mean, there's really no parallel for it in modern times in North America that I can think of, except for maybe the Vancouver SkyTrain. The things that made Montreal work were political will behind it, the fact that they just did it, you know, so they, the Montreal, once they elected Jean Drapeau mayor, Mayor Drapeau said, we're gonna build a subway. I was voted into office on a promise to build a subway. I will build a subway. Excellent construction management. His Lucien Saulnier, who was the chief construction manager of the project, was brilliant and did a great job. And importing known quantities from abroad. So the Montreal Metro imported a Parisian rubber-tired metro system that was advertised as whisper quiet. And this was just bought off the rack. There was lots of beautiful architecture that was part of the planning process and that was built into the Montreal Metro. But ultimately, once the decisions were made, there was no further public discussion. They just went and did it. One thing that I think is really illustrative for this is that Montreal had a fire lit under its tuchus for two reasons. So the political opposition kind of melted away. The first is that they're in the middle of a rivalry with Toronto. And Toronto had built a subway in 1954 that was hailed as the coolest thing since sliced bread. Although some smart Alex said that that the train stations looked like bathrooms without plumbing because they had the white tiles that looked like they belonged in your bathroom. Yeah, subway tiles. And the other thing was that Montreal was going to host a World's Fair in 1967. And so there was impetus for Montreal to put its best face forward for the entire world. A similar situation happened in Vancouver in 1980 when they were awarded the 1986 World's Fair, where the newspapers mocked them for saying, how are we gonna have a World's Fair about transportation in a place that doesn't have a rapid transit system? What are you guys thinking, dudes? Like, really? And so, because there was that political push, Vancouver figured out a way to build an automated elevated on the cheap, and to get the political support behind it to build it in time for the World's Fair in '86.
Can I, on these examples you just said, they involve a World's Fair, which means maybe new land use patterns. So when they built this stuff, was it through existing or over existing neighborhoods, or was it on it mostly oriented toward land that wasn't really in use at that time?
So the Montreal Metro was built in a deep tube fashion, so they didn't have to go, so there was not a whole lot of disruption to the surface. And these stations were built in extremely densely populated areas, but the station footprints themselves are pretty small. They're significantly smaller than the footprint of, say, the Ashby Bard in Berkeley. They're much more like the 16th Mission Bard or the 24th Mission Bard in San Francisco, where there's one or two entrances that go straight down. And there's not a whole lot of, they are digging through densely populated areas. The subway is all deep tube, but it also doesn't require a ton of surface disruption the way that cut and cover would. With the Vancouver SkyTrain, they got lucky because, first of all, they had a disused interurban right-of-way that was convertible into an elevated. And second is the downtown section of the tunnel already had a disused freight tunnel that was convertible. So there was a ramp, but there wasn't a whole lot of land acquisition involved.
Thank you.
And what about the new construction in Vancouver? Are you following that?
Oh boy, that's a mess.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great presentation, and I agree with, I think most, maybe all of your conclusions, but I will be provocative on purpose.
Provoke, go for
I think
it.
that, I haven't heard anything in your presentation about the American people that actually choose again and again in the last 50 years buying a bigger backyard and having the kids playing soccer outside and buying, bigger houses and 3 cars. And there is not much demand for and any apartments around parks or people who wants to live in the sixth floor like in Barcelona. Now, we have much more land in Europe. So where is the choice, the market for what you propose? Maybe it's not.
No, I think the market absolutely exists, and you can understand that the market exists by the fact that it's really, really expensive to live in places near a train station where it's just not allowed to build things near train stations. But you know, if you go to Palo Alto and you want to get a starter home, it's going to run you north of $3 million, which indicates that the land is valuable enough to do that type of development. And in fact, like as of a couple of days ago, we have reports of a 17-story tower being proposed across the street from the California Ave station in Palo Alto, using the state's builder's remedy law to bypass the local rules. So I don't think it's a question of Americans don't want it. I think it's a question of it's not available. And it's very, very difficult to build new places due to the land use restrictions in the states that reflect the kind of environment that's more common in Europe. The only places that I can think of off the top of my head that are doing something like this at scale are Oakland in the city center, Emeryville down in the Bay Area, and then Jersey City and Hoboken across the river from New York City. Like but it's more of a policy question than a question of demand. Because like there's not a whole lot of vacant downtown apartments these days, and they're certainly not cheap. Like we can use price as a proxy for demand. I mean, hell, even in Detroit, like living in the city center is now very, very expensive, and that should indicate the level of demand there.
Well, if I can follow on that, you made the point about development and land value, right? That in the old days, the development matched the value of the land. And now, you know, we mostly restrict development so that you don't get the kind of development that the value of the land could actually support. So the California Avenue project is a good example of that, right?
Yeah.
So two questions related to that. One is, policy has changed in California, or the state is trying to force local policy to change. Hence, the builder's remedy and somebody coming in and proposing 17 stories on California Avenue. So do you think that's gonna help? Are we like, is that part of moving in the right direction?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I lack a crystal ball, sadly. If once I get a crystal ball, I will give you all stock tips. But I think these types of things will help. While I'm not crazy about the loss of local control, local authorities have screwed the pooch for so long that it's not really feasible to have these reforms be made anywhere except for the state government in Sacramento. Like the small towns that make up the entire peninsula or the outer East Bay or Marin County have been so obstructive for so long that I'm not sure that anything except for a state remedy and like even more aggressive state remedies than what are currently available will do the job. It's really not something that I wish had to happen, but in the absence of doing the right thing, like if localities are going to keep pricing out their children, then yeah, the state will have to do something about it, and I hope they do more.
And we may get some density in downtown Davis one of these days.
It's very weird, no joke, like it's very weird coming here and feeling like, oh, this feels more like a proper town center than downtown Davis does. And I'm just thinking to myself, huh, okay, cool.
Except there's only one little restaurant.
Still, yes. In the back? In the back?
Oh, one of the, I guess my question was about the LA Olympics. You know, you had mentioned that there were fairly motivating factor, you know, there's like cities like to leverage these big events. And then, you know, LA 28 and the city of LA, I just attended an event in LA where they were like talking about a lot. they're not really discussing, opening up new subway lines in, advance of the Olympics, mostly because I don't think there's time. But like, what should be done? Like, I guess, because we may not be able to open subway lines in advance of that event.
So, I mean, the closest thing that I can analogize it to is having the entire family over for Thanksgiving. You clean up the house as best you can, but sometimes you just have to shove everything in the garage and hope for the best. I know it's a weird analogy, but like the idea is Los Angeles already had these long programmed funds from measures M and R to build a lot of transit with a theoretical target date of the 28 Olympics. But there's not a whole lot of flexibility that LA has currently because the terms themselves of measures M and R require the money to be spent in particular locations on particular projects. So you can rush them to the extent possible, but it's not really possible to say, well, you know what, we don't really feel like having this subway under Wilshire Boulevard anymore. How about we build a monorail to Disneyland? Like, that's just not something you can do in LA. So it doesn't surprise me that the city of LA's people aren't talking about these types of projects because they're not really, like, their hands are tied. Yes.
So you mentioned these sort of acts that allow various municipalities to be obstructive and block things, and also Prop 13, and that was 1978.
78, yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, as people who were around in 1978, sort of older generation ages out, do you think these pressures will decrease and we'll see more redevelopment in the areas that have been affected by them? Or do you think that these are sort of self-sustaining systems of obstruction?
I don't think they're self-sustaining in the sense that the politics has already dramatically turned against the kind of like against the idea of Prop 13 insofar as like, our neighborhood should be the same forever. We want to keep our houses forever, yada, yada, yada. Like that's already pretty dramatically changed. Like if you had said to me that there would be a ballot measure that narrowly failed to get rid of the Prop 13 exemption for commercial industrial properties, that was the third rail of California politics for decades. The other major issue that I think applies to Prop 13 is that the property tax base in California has been absolutely shredded by Prop 13. And a lot of times, older suburbs that were built in the 1950 to 1978 era are overbuilt in terms of their infrastructure, so you can't maintain what you already have. And so to rebuild your property tax base and be able to maintain your fiscal plan, a lot of things will have to change if you want to balance the budget. So Oakland notably has a ton of projects going in for precisely that reason, because you have long tenured property owners with tax valuations that are sometime in the Stone Age. And the only way to revert those to some kind of reasonably sustainable level is to redevelop. Yes.
I think it's a little bit of a tangent off of that question. You had mentioned that a lot of the impetus for some of these policies was racism or racial covenants in past eras. What do you feel are the sources for the NIMBYism today, and how would we be able to deal with it?
That's an interesting question. So the sources, I think that quite frankly, I think that a lot of the NIMBYism is simply because people who own property in a particular place are quite comfortable with the way that things are. And lacking any particular impetus to change things, they're quite happy with the way that things are, and they don't need to change. I will say that Houston has a really great system for this, in that Houston allows individual blocks to opt out of redevelopment and to have the zoning effect, to have the a particular neighborhood stay frozen in time if you get a majority of property owners on that block to agree. So you can still have this kind of hyper-local NIMBYism, but it's not toxic for the city at large. That's one option that I think should be explored in California policy is that, okay, fine, maybe you don't have these NIMBYist policies citywide, but you could absolutely give the kind of diehards a safety valve by allowing particular blocks to opt out. Yes.
This may not be like your area of expertise, but what do you think is the motivation for small towns to obstruct these like better transit policy options, I guess?
Okay, so I don't,
Can
I'm
you
gonna
repeat
just-
what he said?
oh,
please?
sure. So the question was, why do you think that small towns will obstruct better transit? And I'm gonna dispute the premise of your question because it's not really small towns that are the problem, it's suburbs. Like true small towns, like, you know, like a Winters or like various like vacation towns on the East Coast. Like we're talking, it's very different than say Palo Alto, which is, you know, got a good 60,000 people, or Piedmont, which has 10,000 people, and it's dead center in the middle of Alameda County. It's surrounded by Oakland. You know, like these are not small towns in the traditional sense that are trying to halt mass transit projects. These are generally suburbs, and they're generally pretty well off. Like some of the really interesting research that I've seen on the subject of NIMBYism, mostly focusing on San Francisco, but like the Bay Area at large, is that the NIMBY contingent tends to be older, richer, and whiter than the public at large, never mind what their nominal politics are. That said, I do know that there's some cases of it happening in smaller locales, but it's rare because you generally don't have that type of transit investment in the first place in smaller locales.
Well, so there's some BART stories around this, right? Like Albany didn't want a BART station.
San Mateo didn't want a BART station.
Well, and then the counties that opted
Yeah.
out, yeah, was that a part of your discussion? What happened
Yes.
with BART?
Yeah, so just to cycle back to the BART system, the original BART system was meant to cover the 5 core counties of the Bay Area. Santa Clara opted out from day 0 because they decided that expressways were a great idea, so let's build lots of them. But San Mateo, Marin, San Francisco, Alameda, and Contra Costa were the original BART system. In 1962, right before it went to the ballot, a mall developer named David Bohannon, who built the Hillsdale Mall in San Mateo, started whipping up a bunch of racist fears that BART would bring Black people and Asians down the peninsula, which they obviously couldn't have. And tied to that was the fear of losing shoppers to downtown San Francisco if they had a subway to get downtown. And as a result, San Mateo pulled out of the BART district. And Marin County, which had a tiff with the Golden Gate Bridge Board of Directors, making a bunch of stuff up about whether the bridge could carry tracks or not, both San Mateo and Marin pulled out. Yes.
So your map right here, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and
Where in Cleveland?
right on the former Green Line, Bay
Okay, so you're
Village.
from Shaker?
No, I'm on the west side, Bay Village.
Okay, gotcha, all right, yeah.
So on the Green Line, and eventually the map will come up, quite literally every day on my run growing up, there are the pillars that are the remains of the interurban electric
Yeah.
railways from 120 years ago. My understanding is there were 2 reasons why the interurban railways dissipated in Cleveland. Number 1, it was because the novel invention, the automobile, and there were fewer people riding the railways then. And then number 2, this is my understanding, is that they were eventually bought out by the auto industry and killed off.
It's a great
I
conspiracy theory.
do get this
Yeah.
question a lot, and in general, I will push back on the idea that there was an automaker conspiracy to destroy mass transit in North America. There was no conspiracy. The only place where there was a conspiracy was Minneapolis, where the Jewish mob, a crooked Italian lawyer, and a finance bro got together to
It's like a servitor.
take a,
Yeah,
wish.
They went into a bar, right?
yeah, I know, right, obviously, but yeah, no, it's, no, really, no, the gangster, Isidore Blumenfield is this gangster's name. And so they initiated a hostile takeover of the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company from some very old-fashioned good government Minnesota types and ran it into the ground. All of them got indicted, by the way. And so the crooked lawyer, Fred Ozana, ended up going to prison, getting disbarred. Charlie Green, who was the finance bro, was like, I didn't know anything about this. He got off scot-free. And the mob kingpin beat the charges and was promptly arrested again for transporting a prostitute across state lines. He went down on those charges. They couldn't get him for fraud or murder or racketeering or anything, but transporting a prostitute from Chicago to Minneapolis, absolutely. But aside from that, no, there was no conspiracy. In general, there was a lot of overlap between the rail transit companies and the bus transit companies. So in Los Angeles, the Motor Transit Co. which was running like express buses and was still profitable well into the 1940s, was owned by the Pacific Electric Railway. And so the Pacific Electric Railway actually threatened to abandon their passenger service on rails in favor of express buses on freeways because they were demanding public subsidies. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It's enjoying it all. My question is, today, what arguments do you think could change people's minds to be in favor of transit? And when I say people, I could go either the rich suburbs you mentioned, which could be a bigger problem, because environmentalism hasn't made the cut.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on, I quite frankly think that improving transit and talking about improving transit is a question of providing real concrete benefits. Providing real concrete benefits to people. So if you are somebody like me who has been stuck on the 101 way too many times, both in Northern and Southern California, being able to say, well, look, I could take Caltrain down the peninsula, or I could take the subway instead, is a really convincing argument. But it's a very different thing when you're talking about, say, a Rust Belt city like Detroit or Cincinnati, where the conversation is very different because the question of better mass transit ultimately has to be reconciled with the fact that the city of Detroit has lost 2/3 of its population in the last 50 years. And so it has to be necessarily tailored to what benefits will this give you, the person who's going to be taking the train? There's a wonderful pamphlet from 1948 from something called the Rapid Transit Action Group in Los Angeles. And their goal was to buy out the faltering red car system down there and turn it into something that we'd recognize as light rail today. So, take it, get the trains dedicated right of way, run modern cars, run multiple car trains, run them frequently, the whole 9 yards, and have a subway through downtown LA in order to take streetcars off city streets. But their pamphlet has a wonderful set of arguments, just 4 bullet points saying, what is the benefit this will provide to the working man? What is the benefit this will provide to the salesman? They're all men because it's 1948. What is the benefit that this will bring to the housewife? What is the benefit that this will bring to the person who doesn't own a car? And they say very straightforwardly, you live in Los Angeles, you hate traffic. What is gonna happen when LA has 6 million people, we're already overcrowded and packed at the gills with 2 million. And of course now LA has 12, but you get the point.
And now Measure M, the way they were selling it, people will jump into transit and you can keep driving your car. Please vote for it.
Oh yeah, I mean like Measure M is always going to be something where context. Measure M is the big LA transit is the big transit measure in LA where they permanently raise their taxes in order to build out what's basically the LA subway now and to really finish the thing. And I mean, I think that's always gonna be part of selling it, and this is why I'm also not running for office.
Give someone online.
Sure.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting stuff that you presented. I do have a question for you, which is the following. Because you've tied a lot, or you've spoken a lot of about a lot of the changes in land use compared to what was the case in the early 20th century through the 20th century, concurrently with the changes in the transportation network. And so I'm imagining in a hypothetical alternate universe where private motor vehicles and roads and highways in turn never came about, I can agree with your conclusions that, there would be a lot of safe walk paths everywhere to even just be able to get to streetcars and trains. And you wouldn't have to worry about crossing a wide road or anything like that. And there'd be economies of scale in building trains and streetcars that would allow those systems to be much more widespread in the US and continue growing as the cities would grow too. But I'm not totally convinced that things like Euclidean zoning, racism-fueled urban renewal and restrictive covenants, the urban renewal part could be done just by bulldozing places and replacing them with train lines instead of highways. Floor area ratios, locking in property values in Prop 13, and things like that, I'm not convinced that those things wouldn't have happened with this too. And I'm also concerned that if those things had happened with, the government being on the hook for not only the infrastructure of train systems, but also their operation day to day, we wouldn't necessarily be in any better of a place unless the one, objective here is to save ourselves from the stress of driving. And who knows, that might have been replaced by other stresses too, of having to make so many more transfers and stuff like that. So I'm curious as to your thoughts about this issue. Like, how much are the things that you identified as problems with land use necessarily tied to changes in car-oriented transportation networks, not only just in terms of them happening at the same time, but in a really deeply causal way?
Okay, so there's a bit to unpack there. I think we don't really need to speculate as to the way that things might have turned out. Because we have great examples of what might have been if we look north to the way that Canadians did it. In particular, because Canada started they started building their freeway network significantly later than the United States. They were much more careful about where they wanted freeways and how they wanted freeway sections. And they still had tons of suburbs in places like Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal, or Calgary for that matter.
Calgary.
Yeah, Calgary is quite suburban. But at the same time, even though those land use changes happened, transit works in Canada in a way that it doesn't work in the United States. So you don't really need to make the counterfactual. You can just, you can really just examine the way that Canadians do things.
Love that.
Yes.
So you've talked a lot about standardized construction as a means of cost control. And I can imagine you saying this and a engineering professional saying, well, we can't exactly standardize this station built in this geology, and there's this other station built in this geology. So like, what, in explaining what you think needs to be standardized and what can be more variable to account for variances in, say, geology, how would you explain that?
Sure. So the question is, how do you standardize things when, say, geology or geography might be different? There are always going to be special cases which require a custom solution. So on the first New York City subway line, you have 168th Street, which is built deep underground into the bed of Washington Heights. And that's obviously going to have a different sort of construction than the elevated station 2 miles to the south at 125th, or the underground station at 96th, 2 miles further downtown. The thing is, though, you can standardize a lot of the things like station finishes. You can buy like station layouts don't have to be necessarily custom designed, especially if you're doing an elevated. And a lot of the things that currently get included into these, that get rolled into station costs and things like that, are things that are not actually necessary for the provision of good transit. So like if you, like a classic example is like what do you actually need for a train station, just or a bus station? You need a platform, you need a place for, you need right of way, you need a platform, you need a ticket machine, and you need something over your head if it rains. And like the oldest systems that I've ridden, like the New York City subway, the Boston T, they do simplicity very, very well. And it's easier to adapt simple designs and copy paste them elsewhere than it is to adapt complicated designs. And so like the New York City subway of the early 20th century has the standardized configuration of express tracks in the middle, local tracks outboard, one flight down or maybe two, and side platforms for local stations, island platforms for the expresses. And it saves a whole lot of design work and engineering work if you know what your baseline is going to be from the start.
All right, I'm gonna take the host prerogative and ask the last question.
Sure.
Watching these maps behind you, which I think we all love maps, right?
Yeah.
We all love maps. So do you have a favorite map? Is there a story about like a story that goes with a map, or a story about you finding one of these maps that you'd like to share with us?
Sure, so the question is, what is my favorite map that came out of this project? And that's an interesting question. I think
I don't know, just
I mean,
like,
honestly, my personal favorite map in here is the one that started it all, which is Los Angeles' streetcar system in the early 20th century, because that's where all this started from. My favorite story related to the mapping project is the product of Canadian corruption, where
oh, the Canadians have corruption?
Canadians absolutely have corruption. So connected to the World's Fair, and so this is connected to the Vancouver World's Fair of 1980, where the government of British Columbia said, we're going to host a World's Fair. We need to have this, like, we're going to show off Vancouver to the whole world. And so when the government of British Columbia went to Ottawa asking, hey, can you cut us a check? We'd like to build this, we need to build a rapid transit system like really like fast, like last Tuesday. And so the Canadian government, the federal government of Canada said, okay, we will let you build, we will give you all the money you need and all the political support you need. We will shut down the naysayers so that you can build this fancy automated subway system. However, you have to buy the fancy automated subway system that is that was invented by the failing railway car manufacturer that is owned by the government of Ontario. And you have to specifically buy this system, which not even Toronto wants to buy. Like, this is our hometown thing, we don't want it. And so British Columbia said, fine, this is a shakedown, but we have to build it this way. So this is how Vancouver got the SkyTrain, which is built with all kinds of funky proprietary technology, which is not, which can't be bought off the rack. And so now they're stuck.
Bombardier.
Bombardier was involved, yes.
A friend of mine has the Bombardier chair.
Got it.
UBC. All right, wonderful.
Very nice.
Lots of-